Good afternoon. Welcome. Good to see you all. My name is Jamie Boskett. I have the privilege of serving as president and CEO here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And I'd like to offer a few words of introduction before we begin we welcome our speaker today. First and foremost, I'd like to recognize, I see a lot of familiar faces, many members that are with us today. Thank you for your wonderful support. It bears repeating that, well, we are the oldest cultural organization in the Commonwealth of Virginia and one of the oldest museums in the United States and the only museum dedicated to saving and sharing the whole story of Virginia. We are not a state agency. We don't receive zero government operating support. And so it is through our members, through your generosity, through your participation in the activities and the wonderful things that we do here that this place continues to grow and to thrive. And now, north of 190 years old, we are doing some wonderful work, some of the best work I think we've ever done in our history in the preservation and the education of Virginia's very long and compelling story. A few items that I'd like you to put on your calendar, if they're not already there, for some upcoming events. The first one is just around the corner on March 1st at 6 p.m. I hope that you'll gather here in the Robbins Family Forum for best-selling author and presidential historian Douglas Brinkley. You probably recognize that name. You've probably seen him on some of the news media shows. He will be here presenting on his latest book, Silent Spring Revolution, John F. Kennedy, Rachel Carson, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and the Great Environmental Awakening. Should be a really interesting talk. Just a couple of weeks later, on March 12th at 4 p.m., that's a Sunday, we'll welcome Pulitzer Prize winner Stacy Schiff. She'll be speaking on her very new book called The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams, one of the newest books to come out as it relates to America's founding. And again, you'll note that that's on a special day and a special time. Sunday, March 12th, that weekend, is the 250th anniversary of Virginia forming its Committee of Correspondence. Again, history not often talked about, but this moment that takes place in Williamsburg at the Raleigh Tavern with Jefferson and others penning a resolution to form this communication network that for the first time creates what we would consider a national dialogue and sweeps us 3 years later to American independence. So this we look at as one of the first milestone moments as we at the VMHC and as part of the State Commission for the 250th start bringing forward programming to think about this important semi-quincentennial anniversary of the United States. So for anyone who was around for the bicentennial, I unfortunately was not, so I'm really looking forward to this one. So this will be a great way to get juices flowing and thinking about this important history. So March 12th at 4 p.m., Stacy Schiff. This we do think will be a real sellout. She's not doing a whole lot of other talks within the region, so secure your tickets now if you would. Right after that, the following week will be a very busy week here at the VMHC because it will be the opening of our newest marquee exhibition, Apollo, when we went to the moon. When people think of the history of getting to the moon, both then and now with the Artemis mission, interesting timing, right? They were talking about the history of getting to the moon. Well, we are again going back to the moon, this time to stay for a while. And in this history, well, often associated with Florida and Texas, the brains and the science of what has gotten us to the moon comes from right here in Virginia at NASA Langley. This exhibit will be one of the largest we've ever mounted, spanning more than 3 galleries throughout the building. You probably saw the 1/10 scale Saturn V rocket that's out here in the lobby. That's one of the larger pieces as part of the show, but there's so much more to see. That exhibit will open to the public on March 18th. But for all of you who are members, you get early access. So you should have received an invitation in the mail by now. On March 15th, that Wednesday, you have 2 options to come for light refreshments and to be able to get a sneak preview of that new exhibit, again, stretching throughout the gallery. So put those dates on your calendar. It's really going to be a very exciting spring here with a lot of new and exciting activity. Um, Finally, in just a quick note, we always enjoy doing this, but following today's lecture, the Blackheath Meadery, Virginia's first urban meadery, will be in the museum cafe sampling some of their delicious meads as part of our ongoing cafe series with Virginia makers and producers, something we're really proud to do. We hope that you'll stop in for a quick taste and to hear more about their mission to support Virginia beekeepers and get this taste of a recreation of one of the world's oldest fermented beverages right here in the museum. So that'll be a nice little sweet takeaway after today's lecture. Okay, now turning to our program. Nearly 60,000 free Black people lived in Virginia in 1860, the largest total for any state in the South. Free Black people lived in what you could consider a legal no man's land. They were not slaves, yet by no means free citizens. They built lives of pride and achievement through those surrounded by the inhumanity of slavery, which was ever present in Virginia and beyond. This is a story, this piece of this larger story has been largely overlooked. And that's a need that we are currently looking into here at the VMHC, and we're going to address through an ongoing collaboration that's underway right now. This is an ongoing research effort with Virginia universities, including our wonderful HBCUs and others like William & Mary, that are leaning into collectively supporting a body of research that will manifest into a new special exhibit here in the museum about Virginia's free Black people opening in 2025. So it takes a long road to have this team of experts rally around a narrative for this exhibit and bring forward fresh research, a lot of which will be drawn off the archives here in the museum. So keep that in mind. And it, of course, directly ties to today's topic. One of these neglected stories among this larger body is that of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp, people who emancipated themselves from enslavement and settled beyond the reach of enslavers in order to establish new lives of freedom in a landscape deemed worthless and inaccessible to most. J. Brent Morris is professor of history at Clemson University. Previously, Dr. Morris served as professor of humanities, professor and a humanities department chair at the University of South Carolina, and the founding director of the USCB Institute for the Study of Reconstruction Era. He's an award-winning author of several books, and today his talk will, of course, focus on his most recent work, Dismal Freedom, A History of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. Thank you all for being here, and please join me in a warm welcome for Brent Morris.
Thank you for that great introduction. And there's so much exciting stuff coming up at the museum. I can't wait to get back here and see what evolves from it. But I am here today to talk about my recent book, Dismal Freedom, A History of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. And this is a 3-century history of thousands of men, women, and children who emancipated themselves from enslavement and then established lives of freedom for themselves in one of the most foreboding landscapes in all of America. They certainly didn't find easy lives in the Great Dismal Swamp, but these were lives always understood to be preferable to one more day spent enslaved. And it may really be the most amazing story I think I'll ever have a chance to tell. 2 decades it took me to uncover the story. I started and stopped several different times when I became so discouraged by not being able to get actually into the sources, be able to tease out the tiny bits of evidence that existed out there. I went off to grad school fully intending to write a dissertation on the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. And it didn't take me long to realize that it was going to take a very long time to develop the skills necessary to find people who didn't want to be found. They were incredibly good at staying below the radar. It wasn't just a raging case of imposter syndrome either when I went off to grad school. That was there, of course. But other people throughout history had tried to find the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons and had very little success themselves. There was an abolitionist named Edmund Jackson, and he published one of the very rare accounts of the Dismal Swamp Maroons in 1852. And he said, though he believes the swamp to be, quote, a city of refuge in the midst of slavery and a home to a large colony of Negroes, who originally obtained their freedom by the grace of God and their own determined energy, he couldn't really say much more than that. He did conclude, though, that how long this colony has existed, what is its amount of population, what portion of the colonists are now fugitives, and what the descendants are fugitives are questions not easily determined. Reliable information about the Great Dismal Swamp and its Maroon inhabitants was nearly impossible to come to by outsiders. Jackson wasn't in the know, and those that were in the know closely guarded the secrets that they held very close to the chest. 4 years after Jackson wrote about the swamp, there was a journalist named David Hunter Strother. He went on assignment to the Dismal for Harper's Monthly with the specific hope of glimpsing one of these legendary fugitives. One day he went out into the swamp by himself, and he did stumble upon a very fierce-looking and legendary Maroon leader named Osman. Strother's curiosities were quickly replaced by the terror of being himself discovered by the well-armed, notorious man known as, quote, the protector of fugitive slaves. He wasn't discovered, however. Seconds seemed like an eternity, though, and he could only shake off his paralysis once the man he titled the Sable Outlaw had disappeared back into the swamp. All Strother took away from his experience was adrenaline and the image of Osman seared into his memory, from which he made a very quick sketch afterwards. And when he got back to the camp, he couldn't extract more intelligent than this man's first name from two enslaved men. Both clearly knew much more than they let on, but they also seemed terrified to have given away even that little bit of information to an outsider. You see, to the swamp's inhabitants, secrecy and complete scission from the outside world was the point. Maroons, these are men and women who freed themselves from enslavement and formed independent communities. They set out to remain undetected, out of sight, and concealed as much as possible, and they were remarkably successful in this goal. The immense swamp, too, guarded their secrets. The Great Dismal Swamp extends north and south 50 miles inland from the Atlantic on both sides of the Virginia-North Carolina border, and originally covered a territory of about 2,000 square miles, roughly the size of the state of Delaware. As colonial maps of Virginia and North Carolina Tidewater region filled up from the early 17th century, the Dismal Swamp, or the desert as it was actually sometimes called, it remained an enormous, dark, and daunting blank space on these maps. The swamp has always been a tangled web of confusion to any outsider who enters. Deep, stagnant pools of water, islands higher ground here and there, slow-flowing waterways, towering white pine, cypress, juniper, gum trees, briars, bushes, vines, reeds so thick you can barely push through them. Mud, my goodness, the mud. It's not to mention the wildlife, though. Clouds of bloodthirsty insects, black bears, alligators, several varieties of poisonous snakes, feral cattle and hogs, and the occasional wolf and bobcat roam both bogs and dry patches throughout the swamp. And I'll tell you from spending some time in the swamp, it's the yellow flies, the biting flies that come out in June that are the worst, worse than any snake or bear that I encountered in the swamp. But very few white people of the colonial and antebellum plantation country had any reason whatsoever to approach the Dismal Swamp or to pay much attention to its existence. That is, other than the fact that it served as a magnet for their enslaved people. For those who slaved on labor camps nearby and even hundreds of miles away, refuge beckoned within the swamp's depths. The dangers of the Dismal hardly seemed like an appealing setting to build a life, but for some, the worst day of what I call dismal freedom was better than the best day enslaved. Maroonage, or the process of becoming a Maroon, it occurred to some degree wherever and whenever slavery existed in the Western Hemisphere. It was, in the words of one scholar, the most pervasive form of fugitive slave community formation, negotiation, and enslaver accommodation in the history of the Atlantic world. It was also one of the most dynamic and impactful ways enslaved people resisted their bondage. Though ever present in the Americas, Maroonage varied significantly over time and space, and scholars have spilled a great deal of ink attempting to define Maroonage, using its factors in different cases: the length of time a person stayed away from the slave labor camp, manifestations of class struggle, intentions to remain away permanently, individual versus group Maroonage, degrees of removal from the capitalist mode of production, geographic proximity to slave labor camps and plantations, among others. But I argue that the concept of marronage should be applied to the entire process of self-emancipation. It extends through the whole of their fugitive experiences, from the first acts of escape from bondage through their self-earned extra-legal freedom, whether that entails a permanent settlement as part of a community or a much more transient life. A Maroon, then, is someone who has self-emancipated themselves from enslavement or is born outside of enslavement to Maroon parents and lives in defiance of the laws of the enslavers that would limit their freedom. A person could Maroon for a day. A person could Maroon for a lifetime. They could be alone or in a village, achieve permanent freedom, or be re-enslaved. They could settle into a life in the wilderness, take up arms against their oppressor. They could set their sights on the nearby plantation country for revenge, plunder, or liberation. And the Dismal Swamp Maroons did all of these things. But the result was always the same. The result, or their end goal, was always freedom. Now, freedom, even in the Great Dismal Swamp, was many things. And from the title of the book to the final pages of it, I attempt to complicate just what we mean and what we understand by the word freedom. Maroons risked their lives to escape, and then purposefully chose a life of exile in the swamp over attempting to continue northward. Freedom was never limited to free states above the Mason-Dixon line or even Canada. And dismal freedom was not necessarily a second best option in escape. Very often it was a goal in and of itself that in many ways offered greater independence than if one reached a northern terminus of the much mythologized Underground Railroad. Outsiders describe the swamp as impenetrable and unlivable, but Maroons knew otherwise. In the swamp, they took control of their own lives and destinies. They married, they had children in the swamp and formed families away from the control and ownership of white enslavers. They maintained a cultural life beyond the supervision of whites. They cultivated garden plots. They raised livestock, built and lived in permanent and substantial structures miles into the swamp. And they freely traded goods and services over a territory of thousands of miles. Some people were born, lived, and died in the Great Dismal Swamp without ever knowing another home, without ever seeing a white face. Others stayed for years before leaving the swamp following the Civil War. That they did so in less than ideal circumstances and with less flexibility to do exactly as they pleased only places them somewhere on a very broad continuum of freedom and unfreedom in the antebellum South, any point on which people could thrive relative to their circumstances. And thrive they did. From the 17th century through the Civil War, thousands of Maroons escaped to the swamp, where they established dozens of permanent communities. There they lived and died in the midst of the Tidewater Slave Society, the largest in North America. The way these communities functioned varied very much depending upon when and where a given community formed and what motivations individuals and groups had for marooning. And I detail several types of this in the 4th chapter of the book. But together, these communities established an extraordinary and historically significant world within the Dismal. And despite the remarkable lives of Maroons in the swamp, their experiences went under-recorded in the documentary record. Now, this, of course, was by design. Dismal Swamp Maroons were highly successful in concealing themselves, but their flight into the swamp, well beyond the gaze or reach of outsiders, has continued to be much more successful in hiding them than they ever would have imagined. The very few sources that they left have seldom attracted the sustained attention of historians. They only hint at a story that's very intimidating in the silences that a researcher encounters, mostly undocumented and seemingly irretrievable. But I knew even before I could really do it myself that this history had to be recovered. We know from the study of hemispheric marronage that the phenomenon was the very antithesis of what whites asserted to be the bedrock of pro-slavery ideology. And that was essentially that people of African descent were incapable of surviving without the beneficent oversight of white people. It was that they truly didn't ever desire to be free, that slavery in some way was a favor done to them, that they were in every way inferior to whites. Maroons, however, were an obvious weakness in the slave system, and they couldn't be hidden. There was one that directly challenged white authority and white supremacy. North American Maroons just left a very thin paper trail. Maroons in other places, Mexico, Brazil, Jamaica, entered into negotiations with colonial authorities, left a much stronger paper trail. There's a lot more scholarship that deals with them. But in North America, the opposite is the case. Very few historians have taken up the challenge of uncovering the histories of marronage in the British North American colonies or the United States. And I'm happy to talk about different historians that have taken different approaches to this story later on. But it's important to know that my book, Dismal Freedom, is really the first and only comprehensive history of the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp, which was the largest and most important group of Maroons in all of North America. And it took 2 decades of digging in the documentary source material to really find the Maroons and to hear their voices. And it also took 2 decades of literally digging in the swamp itself, along my colleagues in the Great Dismal Swamp landscape study. This is an archaeology-focused research group that's been funded by the NEH and other organizations, which was convened to recover interpretable archaeological information about pre-Civil War swamp communities that existed within the current bounds of the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. The Great Dismal Swamp Landscape Study undertook archaeological fieldwork in 2003 through 2006, and then most recently 2009 to 2013. And this represents the first and only extensive archaeological research to ever take place in the refuge or even within the historical boundaries of the Great Dismal Swamp. To date, the research group has generated one of the largest archaeological and historical data sets on the marginalized communities in North America, including the most detailed and expansive body of materials related to Maroon communities currently available in North America. The archaeological fieldwork, which I only played a small role in helping out one summer, my own documentary research, and the utilization of new technology, which is actually fascinating, and geophysics, ground penetrating radar, electrosensitivity, LiDAR imaging. All of these things have conclusively demonstrated the existence of Maroon communities and settlements throughout the swamp. Just getting to that conclusion was a struggle, but it was a huge conclusion that we were able to make, because up until that point, people just didn't believe that the swamp could have sustained such large numbers of people, that the stories of the Maroons must have been legends. As a historian, I was doing documentary research, and what the archaeology allowed me to do was to fill huge gaps in my documentary sources. Up until this point, no other historian has incorporated or had access to the archaeological record of the Dismal Swamp Maroons. And really, only through a very interdisciplinary approach could this fascinating story ever be told. And importantly, I think, told through the voices of the Maroons who actually lived in the swamp. The voices of the people. I mean, this is what every historian, when they're writing a book or an article or anything, tries to get down to. I try to have my voice in the telling of the story, but I really want the conveyance of that narrative to be in the voices of those that lived this history. And scholars have very seldom listened for those voices. It's a lot of work. It's hard work to sort of hear those voices in the loudness of other sources. Most of the sources dealing with the Dismal Swamp Maroons have nothing to do with the people that actually lived the history. They're written by folks outside the swamp looking in. But Maroon voices were very often deafening in the American South. The Maroon voices were deafening in the American South. The fact that they existed was paralyzing to people outside of the swamp, especially in and around the Dismal. And though it would have surprised previous generations of scholars, it's the voices of Maroons that are able to carry most of the arguments of this book. Maroons collectively register one of the most thunderous indictments of slavery to be heard. And the echoes chafed at the ideological bases on which enslavers relied to justify owning human beings. Marronage and the possibility of marronage, and again, all enslaved people were potential Maroons, it just blew up the hegemony of slaver power and replaced it with an unspoken and smoldering charge of impotence to control people who, according to their own ideology, should have been incapable of independent thought. They were undesiring of freedom. It's not what Maroons were saying. Maroon voices also demand a reassessment of the meaning of freedom itself. Marronage and the Dismal represented an alternative to a life of enslavement. It also represented, in many cases, a choice to live free lives in the swamp, in the South, rather than seeking it in a free state or Canada. Maroon voices also remind us that freedom was not just an accomplishment after passage along the Underground Railroad, but it was a marronage process that was sustained by their own heroic efforts. Dismal Swamp Maroons also relentlessly resisted enslavement and the brutalities of slavery through a method, their marronage, that at once shook cracks into the bedrock of the institution, while not usually having as its goal its overthrow. And as their lives and voices make clear, freedom was their primary objective. And all that was part of their Maroonage, including their initial escape, helping themselves to the resources of slave labor camps, seeking to disappear in the dismal, working alongside enslaved canal workers, and sometimes even rebellion. All of those responses to enslavement landed somewhere on this broad continuum of resistance. Now, there are some scholars who have dismissed the impact of North American Maroonage because these Maroons didn't generally wage a constant and outright warfare against their enslavers, as did some Maroons in other locales. But resistance didn't necessarily have to have revolution or even a direct critique of the slave system as its goal. In the Dismal Swamp, even when Maroons didn't directly violently attack their enslavers or rise up in rebellion, their very existence and total defiance of their enslavers maintained the constant potential for such action. And the impact of Dismal Swamp Maroons' resistance was thus cumulatively overwhelming, if not ever directly catastrophic. Now, talking more about voices, the hostile voices from outside the swamp very often referred to Maroons as lurkers, as villains, as rogues, as runaway, as fugitives, wild men, bandits. They didn't recognize the Maroons' desire for an achievement of freedom as legitimate. And so what they did was they denigrated it, and they defined self-emancipators in the insulting terms of their own laws and customs. Maroon Voices, however, asserted their dignity and humanity, and they didn't recognize enslavers' authority and laws and ethics. They were no longer slaves. They were not afraid. And in their world, in the swamp, they were just about as free as any other American. Maroons named themselves, as did the remarkable Jack Dismal. They fully came of age as men and women through their Maroonage, as did the very brave John Nichols in the Civil War. The first self-governing African-American communities, North or South, included amongst them the Great Dismal Swamp Maroon communities. So this is a story that tells us a lot about slavery, about resistance to slavery, about the coming of the Civil War, about the ideological history of the United States leading up to that Civil War. But it's also something that tells us a lot about the indomitable human spirit and the lengths that people would go to remove themselves from enslavement and to live a life of their own choosing, of freedom. So quickly, I have a little bit of time left before I open it up to questions, which is always the fun part of a talk. I do want to walk you through sort of the main points of the book. And I'll end it on this image, which is Dismal Swamp Slave Hunt. It was an 1862 painting by Thomas Moran, and I just saw a version of it in the museum just a bit ago, a miniature that he painted. The full version, the large scale, is in Oklahoma, but really captures and represents in a very, very compelling way the experience of Maroons. These couple down here escaping from their enslavement. You've got two dogs sort of in the middle, hot on their trail. It's a bit exaggerated, obviously painted by a white painter without that much firsthand knowledge of the swamp itself. But I thought it made a striking cover to the book. So it's what I suggested to University of North Carolina Press. But anyway, the book itself, I start out by sketching the natural history of the Great Dismal Swamp, and I set the scene for the dynamic human history to follow. The first chapter looks at the little-known history of the earliest European settlements in the area that would become North Carolina at the southern edge of the swamp. And there, a handful of traders, fugitives from indentured servitude, enslavement, poverty, debt, or the law, as well as religious dissenters, made their way south from Virginia as early as the 1640s. And the area became a sanctuary for the renegades of Chesapeake society. The settlers established a society outside of the control of colonial authorities that fostered independence and nonconformity. They valued widespread political participation, held decidedly progressive racial views, and opposed all hints of hierarchy. They were ultimately unable to preserve their independence beyond the Carey Rebellion of the early 1700s, 1708 to 1711, and they fell under the control of the elite Anglican establishment. But sources do suggest that others, likely those of mixed heritage or of African descent, entered into a new life in the Great Dismal Swamp. And that's where chapter 2 begins. It follows the development of the Dismal Swamp Maroons through the colonial era. And this period early Maroon occupation, even though the numbers were few and their organization was likely very limited, there was the beginnings of a program of strategic aggression that originated in the swamp and directed itself outside against the outside society that had oppressed them. Maroon activity increased significantly in the years leading up to 1720 as refugees from the Tuscarora War entered the swamp from the south, and Africans who were steadily increasing in number in the Virginia tobacco country fled there from the north. And the late 18th and early 19th century comprised a new era of armed campaigns originating in and around the Dismal Swamp and striking out at the surrounding slave society. Now, there were certainly no Maroon Wars in North America on par with those of the Caribbean. Chapter 3 does make the argument that altogether, the aggregate of guerrilla raids from within the swamp, Maroons' involvement in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and connections to and participation in later slave rebellions, it represents within the context of North American slave resistance and rebellion, probably the closest comparable phenomenon in North America. Now, admittedly, these were very often small groups, but the raids were chronic. They weren't just episodic. And the evidence suggests that some of these raids were often part of something much larger, of plans and collaborations over a large area and among different groups of Maroons and enslaved and marginalized people. And although the potentially cataclysmic nature of the Maroon threat was constant, if not necessarily potentially cataclysmic, although importantly, it may have seemed that way to people at times, it was altogether real. Maroon guerrilla activity certainly resulted in greater property loss than the Nat Turner Rebellion or the thwarted Gabriel Rebellion as well. Maroons were not simply provisioning themselves for raids, though. Most Maroons had once been valuable enslaved property, and the process of their marooning had been, at least from a white perspective, the act of stealing themselves from their owner. An estimate from the 1850s suggests that the Maroons of the Dismal Swamp represented about $1.5 million worth of slave property. Now, that might have been a little bit high for any given time, but it was actually quite low if you consider from the perspective of the 200 years that the Dismal Swamp served as a beacon for Maroons. Maroons themselves had their primary goal to remain undetected. And like I said, they were incredibly successful at this. But the fourth chapter looks very closely at the lives that the Maroons lived. It's my favorite chapter. I loved writing it. It reconstructs a partial portrait of their lives from the evidence provided by contemporary documents, oral history, and of course, the recent archaeological discoveries. Maroons established distinct settlements across the vast Dismal Swamp, and it reflected the residents' diverse motivations for marooning. Recent digs in the swamp have uncovered evidence of Maroon structures, as well as demonstration of cultural features across several dry islands in the swamp. Satellite images indicate that large islands greater than 20 acres total and smaller clusters of islands, 50 or more acres in the aggregate, exist across the swamp. Very easily could have been conducive to larger scale settlement. Islands that have been surveyed by the Great Dismal Swamp Landscape Study represent about 1% of the Great Dismal Swamp wildlife refuge acreage. And they range from 1 to 39 acres and are often found in clusters with as little as 50 feet of swamp separating them. Some are as high as 10 feet above swamp level. The final 3 decades of Dismal Swamp marinage through the end of the Civil War from this swamp represented escalations of previous eras of confrontation. The 5th chapter recounts this growth and the experience of a very new generation of Maroon leaders in guerrilla warfare and their increasing notoriety in American popular culture, which had already begun to strike at the very foundation of the Tidewater Slave Society by the time many Maroons left to join the Union forces in dealing a final blow to slavery in the Civil War. It was also during this last antebellum decade that all of this, the accumulated intellectual burden of more than 2 centuries of Dismal Swamp marinage, became unbearable for white supporters of slavery in the Tidewater and beyond. Despite the apparent decrease of Maroon activity from the swamp after 1831, the year of the Nat Turner Rebellion, the symbolic shadow of the Great Dismal Swamp, it grew over the swamp and over the South. Ultimately, the Great Dismal Swamp, by virtue of their very existence and resilience, drove a nail into the coffin of North American slavery. When the war ended, the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons quietly emerged from the swamp and then disappeared again, this time into the bustle of a world where slavery no longer existed. But now they traded one set of dangers for another, traded bears and rattlesnakes on the one hand, which were no longer a constant threat to their safety. But many now former Maroons were a bit skittish on the outside after many years or even a lifetime in exile. They would have to wrestle with the ambiguous meanings of freedom, their place in Reconstruction governments, and then later, a Jim Crow world that led some former Maroons back into the only secure and safe place they had ever known, the Great Dismal Swamp. Some, before their return to the swamp, told their stories of dismal freedom. One character that I encountered that I really loved writing about was a man named Long Davy Costin. And Long Davy was one old Maroon who sat down with an interested writer who had been fascinating. This is in the 1880s, but fascinated by the legends of marronage in the swamp. And he asked Long Davy about his experiences living there. And Davy prepared his listener for a very long story. He said, "Boss, you ask me hard questions. I tell you, boss, when you get in the desert, the dismal, if nobody sees nothing, the runaway catchers can't catch you." Davy's invitation to his amazing tale still echoes over a century later as an appropriate introduction to my book that tells his story and that of thousands of others with whom he shared the swamp. Davy said, "Get off your horse and sit down. I'm going to tell you something important." And the story of the Dismal Swamp Maroons, I think, is very important. And I could talk about this for days and days and days, but I think we have an hour. So hopefully there's enough time for questions. So I thank you for the invitation to speak. I thank you for your attention, and I welcome questions. Thank you.
And we do have a microphone, so if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring it over to you.
During the early parts of the Dismal Swamp, how much mingling was there with the indigenous people?
There's a great deal, and probably the success of people of African descent in the swamp would not have been possible but for the experience in the swamp of Native Americans first. For indigenous folklore, I mean, the swamp was a territory that was utilized by these groups back to time immemorial. It had its significance as a hunting ground, as a religious sort of a holy place in certain cases, probably. And Native Americans didn't need to actually live in the Dismal until they were pushed there by European encroachments. But some did. And I think the early stages of figuring out how in the world to live and to make a life in the swamp, those secrets were figured out by Native Americans, who then conveyed the secrets to the African Americans and white debtors and fugitives from justice. I mean, it was really a sort of this very multiracial cosmopolitan group of people that lived in the swamp, at least in the late 1600s, early 1700s. But the archaeology too speaks to this really in interesting ways. There were instances of what clearly were Dismal Swamp Maroons mining the swamp for Native American artifacts. And they would find these artifacts and retool and repurpose them into something that they could use. So they might find an arrowhead and sharpen one side and use it for a scraper for leather or something like that. Tools were hard to come by in the Dismal Swamp, and you took what was there. And one of the most valuable resources for Dismal Swamp Maroons in the 1800s were artifacts that had been lost or discarded by Native Americans thousands of years, sometimes before. And there was probably some, intellectual connection there too. There was the understanding that the tools that make my life possible were left here by other people who are also finding themselves on the wrong side of this society, who we share certain life experiences with. There were actually instances where Dismal Swamp Maroons built their houses in the swamp and shored up the structure with pieces of Native American pottery. Possibly just, for structural reasons, but also possibly symbolic as well, to make sure that that Native American history was incorporated into their lives as well.
I understand from some of the experiences there that some of the white people wanted to drain the swamps. Was the fact that there were these Maroons living there have an influence on that proposition?
It did. And some of these white people that wanted to drain the swamp, I just saw peering down at me as I walked through the museum before the talk. William Byrd II, and then later on George Washington, they had proposals to drain the swamp. Very ambitious men. And when it came to fighting the British, George Washington was successful. When it came to fighting the Great Dismal Swamp, he was an abject failure. But he was a partner in the Dismal Swamp. It was the long original title of their group was Adventurers to Drain the Dismal Swamp. And Washington wanted to drain the swamp, to turn it over into agriculture. Eventually, he had dreams of cutting a canal through the swamp, which eventually happens. But the greatest extent that he could come to having a canal was from the western edge of the swamp to Lake Drummond, which is now called Washington Ditch. It gives you a sense of just how grand that canal was. But yeah, they had plans. The Dismal Swamp Company brought in enslaved people to do most of the work, do most of the digging, which was some of the worst work that you could have tasked upon you as an enslaved person. And the swamp it was indomitable. I mean, the swamp fought back at least. And they were never able to bring to fruition their plans for the Great Dismal Swamp. I mean, it's still there. Most of it's been preserved now, but I mean, it's well before people started thinking about the swamp in terms of preservation. It was still this blight on the landscape that nobody could bring to bear. They could not tame it. And the Maroons were there. They were. William Byrd refers to Maroons a couple of times in his narrative of surveying the boundary between North Carolina and Virginia. Now, Byrd, of course, never actually went through the swamp himself. He had his surveyors cut the line through while he hung out with some of his friends on the outside, but definitely took credit for it and wrote. He hated North Carolinians too. Always wrote about North Carolinians in a very insulting way, but on the North Carolina side is where you run into these fugitives, he said, and he early on understood that North Carolina's policies of, in a lot of ways, sort of welcoming fugitives from justice, whatever race or ethnicity they might be, with open arms was a problem. And not just because it made it hard for Virginians to collect on debts or to keep their enslaved people in the field, but he said, Rome was also founded by fugitive slaves. And if you don't watch out, you're going to have an empire like Rome rising up in your own backyard. And that, in a lot of ways, was what people were afraid of at the Dismal Swamp. There was never a case where the Dismal Swamp Maroons were able to come together and leave the swamp as like a big army of liberation to bring down slavery. But white people didn't know that. They didn't know exactly what the communication networks were, what the extent of organization might have been. And it's remarkable when you read outside descriptions of the swamp, when they're talking in terms of the human residents of the swamp. They always describe the situation in terms of like a natural disaster, of an earthquake waiting to happen, or a volcano that's building up pressure and about to blow. These cataclysmic events that, in the minds of North Carolinians and Virginians, a large-scale slave rebellion was the same as a volcano going off in their backyard. So the early attempts to actually get into the swamp, they were very much aware that the Maroons were there. It didn't concern them too much, but it didn't really play into what happens much either, because they just were so unsuccessful that they didn't have to encounter too many Maroons.
Were the communities within the swamp connected? Did they join together for strength at all?
They did. It's hard to. There's so much in the swamp that I would love to know, that I know happened, but I can't really put my finger on it and say with any certainty that yes, this happened. But the connections between different communities certainly existed. There's evidence of, from time to time, slave rebellions being planned. And the planning happens on both sides of the Dismal, in North Carolina and the Virginia side. And the only way that could have been possible was through the swamp. And the only way through the swamp is with people who are in the know, who actually know the way through the swamp, and importantly, would be allowed to pass through the swamp without, being captured by Maroons, who were always, they had sentinels posted at different points in the swamp. They always were on the lookout for incursions. So the fact that there were these sometimes large-scale operations that were planned in ways that could have only been done through communication over and through the swamp, it does make me think that there was certainly some sort of communication network. You also see in the archaeology, you see in the material culture that's brought out of the ground in these different communities, you can actually trace this through the different types of glass that show up in the ground at Dismal Swamp sites. There are some sites that have high deposits of certain colors of glass and others that have low, but you can actually, if those that know it, the archaeologists who are really good at this can actually figure out, where certain pieces of glass or shards might have come from. And those are spread across the swamp in a way that suggests widespread and very well-organized trade networks. So the glass would be, in glass, when you're in a swamp without any sort of, tools, you use what you can, and glass is really useful. Glass, rocks that might be brought in, Native American artifacts. Certain parts of the swamp were rich in glass, for instance. Certain parts of the swamp were rich in deposits of Native American artifacts that had been lost. Everybody needed access to both. And certain parts of the swamp had the ability to grow corn or other crops on a much larger scale. And by trading with each other, there was this inter-swamp trade network that kept everybody afloat. So they didn't necessarily share communities together. And not all Maroons they didn't know how many other Maroons were in the swamp, and they probably didn't know the extent of all the other communities. But they were certainly aware that they were not alone in the swamp, and their communication networks were certainly there.
How much more research is going to be done with the ground penetrating radar and the LIDAR? Is there anything else going on with this?
The archaeologist who was the director of the Dismal Swamp Landscape Study published his work in 2014. And then while keeping this in Dismal Swamp research kind of to the side, always kind of coming back to it from time to time, he's moved on to other projects. The purpose of the archaeological work was really not to exhaustively excavate the swamp, but it was just to prove that what we thought always was the case really happened. So the sum total of area in the swamp that's been excavated has probably been less than 50 square meters. But they've been able to find corners of structures, all sorts of things that fill in the gaps of the documentary record to help us know exactly, as close as we can, to knowing what was going on. The LIDAR was and is particularly useful in determining where the higher spots in the swamp are. Most of the swamp has still not really been accurately surveyed. And where there's a big, a 10-acre island that's maybe 5 or 6 feet above the water level, the swamp level, based on what we've already determined, you can be fairly certain that people lived on that island. So there are 90% probably of the Maroon communities that existed in the swamp have not been excavated. We know they were there, but the archaeologists, they've done what they've done and they've accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. And it was never to really pull every artifact out of the ground and be able to answer all the questions. It also gets tricky too, because where the most excavation has happened, there's also a pretty large island adjacent to it that hasn't really been touched. The question of where did Maroons bury their dead comes up a lot. And when you come across a set of bones or a human body in the course of archaeological excavation, everything stops. There's a ton of red tape that comes into it. So the archaeologists have purposefully tried to stay away from areas that they think might actually contain human remains. The ground penetrating radar is really useful once you've identified the higher elevation points of the swamp, of using that to try to figure out what parts of the ground have been most used by humans. You can find trails where people walked very often. You can find where human activity was the highest, and you can assume from those readings that there must have been a community or a village there. The island that was most thoroughly excavated, in a lot of ways, kind of tells us all we need to know about the swamp, because there is evidence of human habitation on that island all the way down to the elevations of the island that would not even have been dry all the time. So that island was occupied, packed solid with people to the maximum capacity. And if that was the case, they wouldn't have packed it to that capacity if there were other places that were still vacant. So we can assume that, this 10-acre island over here must have been at the same time as solidly populated as other places, because of the one that we know, people were living in the mud because there was no other room to build a house or to live. And that must have been the case that, if it was that bad, the other islands must have been as heavily populated too. And it's the sort of thing that, we welcome any sort of new technology that can make this job easier. The amount of research I was able to do online during the COVID lockdown was just amazing. And people 10, 20 years ago wouldn't have had access to the same things. The archaeology is the same exact way. Being able to learn through ground penetrating radar what's underneath the ground without digging before saves a lot of time, saves a lot of expense. So all of these technological advancements have really made it possible to tell this story in a much fuller way than would have been otherwise.
Do you have a question, sir?
So I've read in a couple of places that sea captains or ships' crews used to come to the swamp to collect drinking water for the ships because of the tannin in the water preserved it. It didn't go off in the ship's casks. So are you aware, or did you find any evidence of interactions between the Maroons and the ship's crews, maybe trade or maybe crew were recruited from them or whatever it might be?
Yeah, so the water in the Great Dismal Swamp is a very, very dark amber color. It's a peat swamp. So that water just sort of steeping in the peat there's a story that I read from the late 1800s, and there used to be a hotel on the border between North Carolina and Virginia on the canal called the Halfway House Hotel. And there was a bar, and there was a guy that came in there from the canal. He got off his boat, went into the bar, and there were two pitchers on the bar. One was of clear liquid and one was of brown liquid. And he was going to mix himself a drink. And he assumed that the brown liquid was alcohol and the white liquid was water. And he got thoroughly drunk because, in fact, the brown liquid was water and the white was moonshine. And he had no idea. But the water itself was, like you said, it was the swamp was highly acidic, and the water would inhibit the growth of bacteria. So these ships that would go off for long journeys, they would come and fill up their barrels with Dismal Swamp water because it would be preserved for long amounts of time. That is a kind of an aside. The fact that the swamp is so acidic means that very few organic artifacts are able to be collected from these archaeological digs. There's a very small section in the Smithsonian African American Museum that has some of the artifacts that we found in the swamp, and they're all very small. I mean, very, very small, and they were recycled down to disappearance because they were so hard to come by. But that was because of the acidity of the water. There were probably interactions with these ship captains at the outskirts of the Dismal Swamp. I mean, I haven't come across any instances where this happened because the captains, I didn't go into their records to try to do the research, and the Maroons didn't keep journals. But there's legends that pirates would go up into the Dismal Swamp to try to get some water, and that's a fascinating story to imagine pirates coming into contact with the Maroons. And but there were later on in the 19th century, there were captains of ships from northeastern ports, abolitionists, who would take on fugitive slaves very often from the Dismal Swamp. And there was one in particular that was known from time to time to actually take his smaller ship or his boat up into the swamp and pick up people in prearranged meetups. It didn't happen a lot because that sort of thing was highly visible and very dangerous. But the knowledge that they were there was, everybody knew the Dismal Swamp was full of fugitive slaves. The people that owned the slaves didn't dare go in to try to claim them back, but abolitionists from time to time would venture into the swamp to try to assist them on to a different type of freedom in the north. And that sometimes happened too. The Dismal Swamp Canal becomes a pretty bustling thoroughfare through the swamp. And there are some instances where people who are, have a barge and are floating corn or whatever down the canal see some Maroons or are attacked sometimes by Maroons. So it happened. There's definitely that sort of interaction. But as far as, the ships that took on the water, I haven't come across too many sources that suggest that.
And I think we have time for one more question here.
Did you speak with any descendants from the Maroons from the Dismal Swamp in your research?
A few. We had a team that was part of the Dismal Swamp landscape study that went out into the community and tried to talk with descendant communities. it's always an important part of any project that when you undertake it like this, you want to try to honor the descendants of the Maroons themselves. But I mean, very often they have the family histories that have the stories. And for whatever reason, there's not a lot of that oral history that's accessible. Or it depends on relationships that are going to take a lot more time to develop. A lot of the people that lived in the swamp came out, and what I guess you could maybe even call like a Dismal Swamp diaspora spread out all over, not just Virginia, North Carolina, but all across the country. A lot ended up in New England, some ended up in Canada, others ended up going back to where they had been enslaved. Tracking them down is difficult, if not impossible. There's a couple of people that I've been able to find in the census in the late 19th century, but the family lines kind of disappear and make it very difficult to get to those direct descendants. There are a couple that are notable exceptions. The family of Moses Grandy, who was a captain on the Dismal Swamp Canal and who had worked in digging of the canals, was enslaved, eventually made it to New England. But that family is very active in getting the swamp history told. But others are reluctant to talk about it. For whatever reasons. A lot of it has to do with lingering senses of shame between being connected to this slave story. And getting past that is a bit of an obstacle. The language people use, I think, is important a lot of times. I mean, when I talk about the Maroons, they are formerly enslaved people, not former slaves. And when I'm talking about slaves, or what people might refer to as slaves, I say enslaved people because that signifies something that's being done to them, not something that's sort of being accepted passively. Slave owners are enslavers. Plantations are slave labor camps. I mean, kind of taking pulling the curtain back a little bit and calling things what they were. I think historians and scholars that are going to continue to take this story and do more research they're going to be able to, I think, access the communities that either hadn't known that they had this in their family past because of books like mine or the archaeologist that published this before, Daniel Sayers. There are a few that are still doing research on the Dismal Swamp, and I know that part of their research plan is to go out and try to get as much information as they can from the descendant communities.
All right. Well, I think that concludes our question and answer time. So again, thank you to Brent.
Thank you very much.
And we welcome you to meet Brent in the lobby, where I believe he will be signing some books if you'd like to purchase one.